There were several candidates for Game of the Day in an exciting fifth round of the British Chess Championships. But in the end, I've chosen a game between Thomas Fodor, Grandmaster, and Richard Palliser, International Master, for my presentation. Hello everybody, Andrew Martin here. Now Fodor has been making a recovery in this tournament after losing early on to Jack Rudd, and one must assume with the white pieces that he really wanted to beat Palliser. So he decides to play the Trompowsky opening, and black responds solidly with d5. Along with e6, these are two of the most reliable ways to meet the Trompowsky. And usually in this position, white takes the opportunity to double black's pawns with bishop takes f6. But g takes f6 has been scoring quite well for black recently, so perhaps Palliser would have done that. Instead, and this is very much in keeping with the way grandmasters have been playing in this tournament, seeking to avoid a very sharp challenge in the opening and just trying to transfer the weight of the game onto the middle game, Fodor decides to play e3. But objectively, this type of play with white can't really give him very much from the opening. And indeed, as we might expect from Palliser, who's extremely well prepared, he plays very accurately in the opening stages of the game. And knight e4 is the start of that process. So white plays his bishop back to f4, and now the queen comes out to b6. And white's next move is a clear sign that, he wants to promote a complex struggle, keeping the pieces on the board. Queen to c1. Of course, white could play queen to b3 in this position, which would have led to an altogether different type of game if the queens were exchanged early. So queen to c1, not the greatest square for the queen, it has to be said. Knight to c6, white played knight to f3, and now a good move, bishop to g4. Already I think black has got comfortable equality. White's queen on c1 is nothing to speak of, and black's development is equally as good as white's. I mean, if you want another move for black in this position, you could equally choose bishop f5. Nothing wrong with that. And if knight bd2, let's say rook to c8. This idea of putting the rook on the same file as the queen, admittedly the file's closed, but there might always be ideas of c takes d4. This is another way to get a decent position with black against lines like this. So Palliser plays bishop g4, which I think you could say is slightly more aggressive because it puts the heat on the knight at f3, and Fodor responds knight e5. And already at this point in the commentary room we were starting to become a little bit suspicious about white's opening idea, because he's wasting a lot of time with his knight here. The queen's on c1, white's position is already a little bit passive. It's very hard to imagine he can get any sort of advantage out of the opening by these means. Now much more straightforward here is knight bd2. But curiously, this could also lead white into trouble. For instance, if black takes this off and white decides to recapture with the knight, I think he should take with the queen, then black can open things up in a similar way to the game by taking on d4 and then going e5. This is an interesting strike. We're going to see Palliser do something like this in the game, and it highlights the poor position of white's queen on c1. Black is starting the action before that queen can get into the game. And already there are some interesting variations here which I have found working with the computer. If white defends f2, black castles, and if white goes knight b3, we've got knight takes e5, knight takes c5, and now rook fe8. All these combinational possibilities are happening because white's so far behind in development. So it turns out white probably has to block the file, again computer generated stuff, and now black piles in with knight f3 check. And you can see the white king is getting into a hell of a mess. So from quiet positions, you can often get very dynamic and interesting middle games. After knight e5, really the position is only interesting for black as far as I can see, because white is getting into a terrible mess. So black is ahead in development after 10 moves. You don't often get into this sort of luxurious situation against a grandmaster very often. And so Palliser decides to open up the game with the help of the excellent move e5. Again, he's training his sights on the dark squares, and in particular the f2 square. There was a previous game, Wang versus Artemenko, which was played in 2009, where black took the bishop, and this is also tempting in order to give a check with the queen. Again, this is leading to a very uninspiring position for white. For instance, he's got to swap the queens here. We're happy to take them off, e5. Only black can be better in this situation. So I'm pretty sure that Palliser would have seen this variation over the board, and he just decided to play e5 because he thought it was superior. And white is now worse. He's got to struggle to stay on the board after only 12 moves. Well, white played bishop out to d3. Palliser took off the bishop, and now, slightly paradoxically, closed down the game with e4. You'd think black would be looking to open up the game and get after the white king, but in fact e4 is the best move. And the reason it's the best move is that it takes white so long to untangle this traffic jam on the queen side. So, for instance, if white goes bishop e2 here, which he didn't in the game, but he could have done, I think black can take his time. You know, he can take off this bishop, he can give a check, keeping the king in the middle, and now just get his pieces out. Because white really can't untangle that easily. For instance, if he goes queen f4 trying to get active, then I think we just go queen b5. And maybe the white queen has to go backwards. If he goes knight d2, then just f5. This is the idea. f5, cramping white, sorry, and something like this. And with f4 coming, you know, black's getting a big attack. White has no counterplay to speak of. So perhaps that's why in the game, Fodor plays bishop c2 instead. Palliser gets his pieces out, and now white tries to target a black pawn by playing bishop b3. But Palliser, very cool, just castles on the queen side. Well, Fodor was probably looking at this position and thinking to himself, how the heck do I get counterplay? I really don't want to take that pawn on d5, but if I don't, he's just going to get a massive attack anyway. So thinking along those lines, white snaps off the pawn and hopes he can survive after e3, which was definitely Palliser's idea. Now he's really thinking, having put his king into safety, to open up the game and get after the white king. But curiously, maybe e3, although tempting, wasn't the best move. Maybe black should have just played bishop c7. It's hard to do that, but you know, when you see e3, it's so tempting. But maybe that was the best move. And the first point of it is that white cannot take that pawn. He gets pinned, white defends, black chops off on g3, king f1, f5. And this is a bit of a killer blow, because after takes, you've got serious problems with the e1 square. Maybe better after bishop c7 is bishop f7. Curious move, but it does dissuade black from putting a rook on e8. Now we go e3. This is better timing. And if white takes with the queen, black can take on b2, so he's got a block. And now we just prise open the king side. We've got plenty of time. We can even allow white to have the illusion that he's going to get his pieces out. But in the end, something like this will happen, and again, white is getting into a terrible mess. But we cannot blame Richard Palliser for playing e3. It looks very tempting, and it's a good move. So white tries to get the pieces off. Black probably has to oblige here, and now queen c6, attacking f3. White breathes a sigh of relief. He castles. Black continues to strip open lines. E takes f2 check, and reluctantly Fodor takes back. Can he hold the fort by playing king g2? Well, very doubtful, because g3 is very weak. I mean, black could already start to prise open lines by playing h5. That's very promising. But perhaps even more promising here is queen to c7. And that is very unpleasant indeed. f4, g5, lines are opening up. If white plays knight a3, we could even take time out to play a6, because white's in a real mess. And again, this move g5 is undermining white's whole king position. So it's doubtful he's going to survive. Hence, king takes f2. Fair enough. Well, now comes the business of opening up lines against the kingside, and Palliser does it very nicely just by sticking all his kingside pawns up. So white must untangle. He attacks f5, black defends. White moves his rook across, again purely defensive, and black now plays g4. Very good move. Every black piece is working harmoniously with the other. The pawns are working harmoniously with the bishop. The queen is now coming into the game against f3. White is really tied up. And the tying up process continues after queen d3, f4, as white is now wide open and none of his pieces could display any activity whatsoever. So what Fodor does is probably best. He even gets the thought that he might get a draw out of this position, with Palliser repeating the position once, but now black comes to his senses and plays a very good move, bishop h2. A double attack, black's attacking g1 and he's also threatening rook takes f3. Incidentally, there is another way to do this. Black could also play bishop e3 check. That was the forcing move we looked at in the commentary room. It's much the same as the game. White's got to take it. We come in with the rook. He's got to take it. Can white scramble a draw from this position? Well, we're going to get a very similar position in the game after bishop h2. Very similar indeed. It's just that the way the game is played, white's rooks are unprotected. So maybe Palliser thought, well, that might help me tactically. I might be able to pick up a piece here or there because of the unprotected pieces. So rook f8 check, king e3, queen h6 check, and now another very reluctant move, rook to g5. You know, going into a self-pin. The reality is that if it was just a question of one weakness, white could probably defend this position. But white's got two problems. The first obvious problem is the open nature of his king. You know, I mean, black can attack that king at a second's notice in this position. The second problem is the passed h-pawn. White's probably got to commit units to look after that pawn, and by so doing his king becomes more exposed. So it's probable that although white might hope for a draw here, he can't achieve it because he can't simultaneously defend his king and act against the h-pawn at the same time. All the same, I mean, I know a lot of players who would have played king d3 here and tried to, let's say, scramble away to the queen side after queen a6 check, king c2. But of course, after that, king d3, white still has to reckon with the h-pawn. So again, this is going to be similar to the game. Rook to g5, well, I mean, you can see this is going to be quite nasty. And Palliser just decides to push his pawn, which I think is right. All the white pieces are still tied down. Rook f2. Probably a losing move. But the pressure is so great that I'm not sure what white can do. I mean, he can, again, try to run away with his king. Then comes rook e8, threatening various things. If white tries to create some sort of haven for his king, I think black can just push this pawn. And if white comes after the pawn, then, okay, the queen infiltrates. I think with decisive effect this time, because white's king is far too open. So dropping back, rook f2, now it becomes easier as Palliser hits the pin rook, white defends, black's happy to chop it off and push his pawn. And all white can do here is to give up the knight for the pawn and hope to erect some sort of fortress. Well, again, the problem is that you have two things to deal with. You've got to deal with the weakness of your queenside pawns, and you've also got to deal with the open nature of your king. I guess what white would like to do is to put the rook on e5 and then somehow organise his queenside pawn so they can't be taken. But it turns out this is completely impossible. The black queen is far too mobile and she gets on the job immediately by playing to b1. And I think this seals white's fate. Well, Fodor played a4. we thought he might try b4. The problem with that is, and it's very quick, queen to d3 check, king moves, and now b6. And that move is the killer, because it completely undermines white's entire position. White can't maintain his rook on a secure square, and therefore black's just going to mop up. So he goes a4, and Palliser plays b6. I mean, already he could have chopped this pawn off. Perhaps he didn't want white to play a5, but even there we can just go b6. This is an absolute killer, this move. It forces the white rook into a worse position, and as you can see, the white queen side is dropping off. So Palliser, yeah, it's a question of style. He plays b6. Fodor plays rook b5, queen d1 check, king e3, queen takes a4. All those pawns are dropping now. Queen comes in. Once the rook is forced back defensively, black can bring his king up. The process is inexorable and completely winning. So white tries a few last moves, probably a little bit disgruntled about the way the game had gone. He can't do anything now. Black's just going to get his king in. Palliser displays excellent technique in the final stages of this game. Queen comes to f1, queen check, king d2, and not waiting for king c4, Fodor resigned. Let's just check this out. If Palliser had been allowed to play that well, as you can see, he's probably going to get mated. So I thought that was a really good game by Richard Palliser. You know, despite the fact that White's plan the opening was insipid, you still have to outplay these guys. You know, Fodor is a very strong grandmaster, and to outplay him in this manner, in this thoroughly convincing manner, was really excellent indeed.